one appeal pending. He's claiming ineffective counsel, and he's been in a wheelchair since 2003. Therefore, he is not a continuing danger and should not be eligible for the death penalty.
I've been working at that tire shop the day I got off work and started driving to Mineral Wells.
These are the words of Danny Bible.
I got that away from her and stabbed her several times in the chest with it.
To know Danny Bible is to know a true serial killer.
Mr. Bible's history of criminal conduct puts him in
Rapist
class
has been
of
put
the
to
worst
death.
of the worst.
Danny Paul Bible was executed tonight by lethal injection for killing a woman in Houston nearly 40 years.
After spending 15 long years on death row, Danny Bible's final night has finally come. The once feared killer, now frail and slouched in a wheelchair, sits in silence as the cold IV lines are inserted into his thin, trembling arms. The fluorescent lights above hum softly, casting a pale glow over his weathered face. His breathing is shallow, his eyes empty, as if he already knows his time has run out. In a few minutes, the lethal drugs will flow, ending the life of a man who left behind a trail of blood and sorrow stretching across multiple states. But before the silence of the chamber claims him, we must go back to where it all began. Because Danny Bible wasn't always known as the ice pick killer. Once he was just a boy from Texas born into chaos, growing up surrounded by violence and neglect. The world didn't shape him gently, and somewhere along the way, something in him broke. To understand how this frail old man became one of America's most sadistic murderers, we have to peel back the years, the crimes, and the lies, to revisit the beginning of a life steeped in cruelty. Danny Paul Bible came into the world on May 5, 1951 in rural Texas, a place where poverty and violence seemed to cling to the air like humidity. He was the kind of child people whispered about, quiet, angry, unpredictable. His childhood was a storm of neglect. His father drifted in and out of his life, and his mother was cold, distant, and quick to anger. There were no bedtime stories, no gentle words, only shouting, alcohol, and fists that taught him early that love could hurt. By the time Danny was a teenager, he had already begun to slip through the cracks. He dropped out of school, stole cars, and ran with older boys who showed him how cruelty could be power. The streets of Houston became his classroom, and manipulation his favorite subject. Inside him grew a deep resentment, a belief that the world owed him something, and that women, especially, were there to be used. He learned to hide his rage behind a calm smile. To neighbors, he was polite. To friends, he was funny. But behind that mask, something darker festered, a hunger for control, for violence, for the rush of domination. Years later, when the first body would surface, people would look back and wonder how they missed it, how a quiet Texas boy became a name whispered in fear. The Ice Pick Killer. It was a humid night in May 1979 when 20-year-old Inez Deaton walked up the porch steps of Danny Bible's small Houston home. She was just there to use the phone, a simple favor, nothing more. But the moment she stepped inside, the air shifted. Bible was on the couch, watching television, expression blank, eyes heavy with something colder than lust. Without warning, he grabbed her. His voice dropped, low and demanding, ordering her to have sex with him. When Inez refused, the calm broke. He tore at her clothes, forcing himself on her as she screamed and fought back. But resistance only enraged him more. Bible's hands wrapped around her neck, squeezing until her voice cracked into silence. And when that wasn't enough, he reached for an ice pick. 11 times he drove the sharp metal into her head and chest, each blow colder, quieter, more detached than the last. When it was over, he stared at what he'd done. No panic, no remorse, just calculation. He dragged her lifeless body into his car and drove through the quiet streets until he reached a nearby bayou, where he dumped her like discarded trash. Days later, on May 27th, a passerby found her body, half-clothed, legs spread, the scene brutal and dehumanizing. Houston police knew they were dealing with something different, a killer without empathy. Shortly after her funeral, Danny Bible disappeared, vanishing north toward Montana and Wyoming. There, he tried to start over, marrying a woman who would soon learn what kind of monster she'd welcomed into her home, one who beat and raped her, just as he had Inez Deaton. By 1983, Danny Bible's violent path had only grown darker. On May 16th, he broke into the Weatherford, Texas apartment of 21-year-old Pamela K. Hudgens, a young relative of his wife. Inside the home that day was Pamela's friend, Tracy Zan Powers, who had come to visit with her 4-month-old baby Justin. What happened inside that small apartment was devastating. Bible attacked everyone there, taking the lives of all 3. Afterwards, he placed their bodies in the trunk of his car and drove to Mineral Wells, a nearby town. Under the cover of night, he left the victims in separate places, trying to hide what he had done. Not long after the murders, Bible fled Texas once again. He left his wife's car at an airport in Midland and disappeared. For months, no one knew where he was. Then, in December, he resurfaced in Belgrade, Montana. There, he went to the home of Leanne Miller, a former girlfriend. Her babysitter recognized him and allowed him inside, unaware of the danger. Once inside, Bible tied both women up and took valuables from the house. Before leaving, he harmed Leanne's 11-year-old daughter, an act that would mark one of the darkest chapters of his crimes. After that night, Bible vanished again, moving from state to state, leaving behind confusion, pain, and fear. But his time on the run was slowly running out. By late 1983, Danny Bible's trail of violence had spread across several states. Investigators in Texas finally gathered enough evidence to charge him with one of the murders, that of Pamela K. Hudgens. It was the only case they felt they could prove beyond doubt. But Bible wasn't ready to face justice. Instead of surrendering, he vanished again, drifting from Spokane, Washington down to Florida, living like a ghost, always on the move, always one step ahead. His freedom didn't last. In January 1984, during a routine police check in Fort Myers, Florida, Bible was caught. He didn't resist. Calm and collected, he waived his right to fight extradition, as if he knew his luck had finally run out. Texas wanted him first, and within days, he was sent back to face trial for murder. That August, Bible pleaded guilty to killing Pamela Hudgens. The court sentenced him to 25 years in prison, but there was a bitter truth behind the verdict. Investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him with the other 2 killings. Tracy Powers and her infant son Justin never received full justice. Their deaths remained officially unpunished, and Bible's smirk in the courtroom showed he knew it. At the same time, Montana charged him for his crimes there. He received 20 additional years, but the court allowed him to serve both sentences in Texas. To many, that felt like mercy he didn't deserve. Bible was sent to a prison in Rosharon, Texas, where the years crept by slowly. But even behind bars, tragedy found him. In January 1992, one of his 7 children, 15-year-old Timothy Martin Bible, was killed in Florida. Reports said a deputy had gone to arrest the teen on forgery charges. When the officer tried to approach him near a drainage canal, Timothy ran. During the chase, the boy pulled out a small handgun. The deputy fired one shot, hitting him in the head. Witnesses later confirmed what happened. The shooting was ruled self-defense, and no charges were filed. But for Danny Bible, hearing the news from inside a concrete cell hit differently. For the first time, the man who had caused so much loss in other people's lives was forced to face his own. He would serve only 9 years before walking free again, older, quieter, but unchanged. The world had forgotten his name, but his crimes hadn't ended. They were only waiting. In 1993, after serving only 9 years of his 25-year sentence, Danny Bible walked out of prison on mandatory supervision. The system believed he was no longer a threat. They were wrong. Bible moved in with relatives in Montana, pretending to rebuild his life. But behind closed doors, the darkness never left him. Over the next 5 years, he quietly harmed several young girls in his own family, acts that would remain hidden until years later. By 1998, Bible had drifted again. On November 8th, while passing through Port Allen, Louisiana, he slipped back into violence. That night, he broke into a random hotel room, not knowing who was inside. The room belonged to Tara Robinson, a woman traveling alone. Bible attacked her and tried to force her into a duffel bag, planning to take her away. But Tara refused to give up. She warned him that her boyfriend would arrive any minute. The bluff worked. Bible panicked and fled into the night. Her courage saved her life and ended his freedom. Police quickly identified him as the suspect and issued a warrant. On December 16, 1998, federal agents arrested Bible in Fort Myers, Florida, the same city where he'd been caught years earlier. This time, there would be no escape. While sitting in a Louisiana jail, awaiting trial for the attack, something inside him shifted, or perhaps he simply grew tired of running. Out of nowhere, he began to talk. He confessed to the old murders in Texas, describing scenes so detailed that detectives knew he was telling the truth. He even admitted to at least 9 other assaults committed across several states. 2 weeks later, Texas investigators arrived in Louisiana to question him face to face. What they heard would reopen cold cases, revive old grief, and seal Danny Bible's fate. When Texas investigators reviewed Danny Bible's confession, they knew it was enough. The details he gave about the 1979 killing of Inez Deaton matched the evidence that had haunted detectives for decades. Her case, cold for nearly 25 years, was finally ready for trial. Bible was officially charged with capital murder and extradited back to Texas to face justice one last time. In June 2003, after a short but powerful trial, a jury needed only 3 hours to decide his fate. The verdict was clear: guilty of first-degree murder. When the judge read his sentence, death, Bible showed no emotion. For a man who had spent a lifetime controlling others, this was the first time his future was completely out of his hands. But fate wasn't finished with him yet. Less than a month later, on July 18, 2003, as Bible was being transferred to Texas death row at the Polunsky unit, tragedy struck again, this time on the open road. While driving along U.S. Route 190, a pickup truck suddenly lost control and slammed head-on into the prison van carrying Bible and 2 guards. The impact was brutal. The crash killed 40-year-old corrections officer John Bennett and 65-year-old driver Ruth Anglin instantly. 2 others, guard Stephen Gardner and motorist Sheena Bates, were hurt but survived. Bible, however, suffered the worst injuries. He broke a vertebra in his back, underwent emergency surgery, and was left with permanent damage. From that day forward, he would live in pain, often confined to a wheelchair, suffering frequent headaches and blackouts. As the years passed, Bible's legal team tried everything to spare his life. They argued that his failing health made him too weak to execute, that his condition was cruel and unusual punishment. But the courts didn't agree. Appeal after appeal was denied, each one bringing him closer to the inevitable. Finally, in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his last request for relief. After decades of evading justice, the ice pick killer had reached the end of every road, and now there was nowhere left to run. By early 2018, the frail and wheelchair-bound Danny Bible had spent years on death row, his body deteriorating from a combination of age, strokes, and chronic illness. But the memory of his victims, and the horror his name carried, remained fresh. On March 12th, Harris County District Attorney Kim Ogg held a press conference that made headlines across Texas. Calmly, she announced her intention to sign a death warrant for Bible, calling him the worst of the worst. For many, it felt like long overdue justice. For others, the question lingered: should a man so broken by time and disease still be put to death? Bible's lawyers argued it was cruel. His veins had collapsed, they said. He was too sick to execute humanely, and the state should consider alternatives like a firing squad or nitrogen hypoxia. But the Texas Attorney General's office dismissed it as a delay tactic. Assistant AG Stephen Hoffman told the court that medical records showed no barrier to a standard lethal injection. Bible, they said, would meet the same fate as every condemned inmate before him. As June 27, 2018 approached, the Huntsville unit grew tense. That night, under heavy security, Danny Bible was wheeled into the chamber, the same room where hundreds before him had taken their final breaths. Reporters from the Houston Chronicle watched as the drugs began to flow. Officially, he gave no last words. Unofficially, some swore they heard him whisper, "It hurts," burning. A haunting end to a man who had caused so much suffering. Outside, the brother of victim Pamela Hudgens said the family finally felt peace. "He'll burn in hell for what he did," he told reporters. For them, closure had arrived, not through mercy, but through the cold certainty of justice carried out.